This is the Craft Equation, where conversations about craft brewing, business, and culture all come together. I'm your host, Cameron, co-founder of Mother Earth Brew Co. Now let's crack one open and get into it. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Craft Equation. I'm Cameron, your host. January, tends to bring a lot of reflection around drinking habits, dry January, moderation, weight management, and questions about alcohol and health all come back into the spotlight. Those conversations often feel polarized. Beer is either framed as something to avoid entirely or defended without nuance. Today's episode, it's about finding the space somewhere in between. So what we're going to do is we're going to go beyond the calories and headlines to talk about the chemistry of beer, what it actually contains, what moderation really means from a scientific standpoint, and also how beer can fit into a balanced lifestyle without fear or exaggeration. I am really, really excited about today's guest because there are very few people who can speak to this topic with both scientific rigor and clarity. That brings me to my guest introduction. This is Dr. Charlie Bamforth. Let's give an applause. Charlie has been a part of the brewing industry since 1978. He's formerly with the Brewing Research Foundation and Bass in the UK. He was lead professor of brewing at UC Davis for 20 years, professor emeritus at UC Davis, and honorary professor with the University of Nottingham in England. He recently retired after 7 years as senior quality advisor to Sierra Nevada Brewing Company and is the author of numerous articles, papers, and books on beer and had received numerous recognitions and honors for his work in the industry. Charlie, thank you for joining us. What an honor. You're definitely the most decorated that I've had on so far. So really appreciate your time doing this with me.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me to join you today. So it's an important topic and a difficult topic in many ways.
It certainly is. Before we get started into this conversation, I just wanted to urge everybody to please like, subscribe, comment, and whatever else you can do to help us out with the podcast. So really appreciate it. And as always, visit motherearthbrewco.com for any of the gear that you see me wearing in this episode. We've got caps, shirts, and all that fun stuff. So that's motherearthbrewco.com/store. Now, as we get into our topic here, in light of the conversation around moderation and alcohol consumption around the first of the year, I'm going to open something that is quite unique, and we actually just released it. In fact, I just announced this via our website and socials last week. It is called Hop Spritz, and this is a carbonated water infused with mosaic hops. There are no artificial flavors, no gluten, no calories, and no carbs. So this is hop-infused sparkling water, and it is delicious. So Charlie, one thing I've always appreciated about your work is that it seems to be grounded in evidence, but also practical. I want to start by a framing question here. Beer often gets reduced to two numbers. It's really calories and alcohol percentage, to make it oversimplified. From a chemist's perspective, what do we lose when we oversimplify beer that way? Why do you think conversations around beer and health tend to swing between these extremes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of prejudice in the world, concerning something like beer, and there are the naysayers, and no matter what you say to them about the content of beer and its role over thousands of years as a fundamental part of society, they just fundamentally put it down as a bad thing. And as you say, there are those at the other end who they don't consider that there are any risks. They blindly plow ahead and say, beer's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, and don't tell me that it's a bad thing. The reality is somewhere in between, and it's very difficult. When you've been in the brewing industries as I have for a long time, and I say to somebody, in moderation, beer is a very good thing, and people are going to say to me, well, you got to say that, aren't you? You're prejudiced, you're biased, you're in the industry, you just want to sell beer. And, I said, but I point out all the pitfalls and all the downsides as well. So it's very difficult. Of course, it's not possible. It's not legally acceptable in this country and many others to actually, within the brewing industry, promote beer as a healthy commodity. You
Right.
can't. Gone are the days when, the likes of Guinness, would market on the basis of Guinness is good for you. And Matteson, looks good, tastes good, does you good. Those days are gone. And we're in an era when you got warnings on the package. But the reality is that the beer is not empty calories. There used to be a professor of nutrition at University of California, Davis, and she would just stand up in front of the class and talk about empty calories. Don't drink beer, it's just empty calories. And I know what she was trying to do. She was trying to sort of caution students against abusing alcohol. And my take on it was tell the truth. Beer is not empty calories, but preach messages of moderation. And that's what I used to do on campus. Very difficult position to be in. But if you've got the professor of brewing science telling you, hey, don't abuse this stuff, drink it responsibly. And if you do that, then there are actually some benefits. It's far more plausible than the naysayers who are not telling the truth when they talk about things like empty calories. So that's a long-winded way of saying, Cameron, that it's complex. And what I've tried to steer is the middle ground. And it's fair to say that some pretty big brewing companies were not happy with me drawing attention to health issues with beer, whether it's positive or negative, because that didn't really fit with their marketing strategies, selling Joe or Jill, 6-packs of beer. So for me to say, hey, enjoy the beer, but drink it in moderation wasn't particularly helpful. And also to them, and also they reasoned that it would actually just stir up the naysayers and the anti-alcohol lobby, which is a very powerful lobby and has got its fingers in many places right now.
You're saying the anti-alcohol proponents, or is
Yeah,
there? Yeah, okay.
there are some very prominent people who over many years now have been strongly lobbying against alcohol, and encouraging things like increased taxation to deter people from drinking alcohol. If people want to drink alcohol and drink it to excess, they're going to get it, and taxation's not going to stop them. But
Sure.
those are difficult areas to get into. But it's a complex situation. The literature you get, and if you pick up the newspaper, it's very seldom that you hear what a brewer would consider a good news story. It's pretty negative all the time.
Yeah.
And it's now been established that, and shown very clearly that some of the prominent papers that are basically saying there's no safe level of drinking alcohol, they're flawed. And the statistics that they claim to contain just aren't genuine. There's a guy in the UK called Sir David Spiegelhalter, and he drew attention to a paper, a very, very prominent paper published a few years ago in The Lancet, the leading medical journal. And basically what this paper said and concluded was there's no safe level of drinking alcohol. And the best recommendation is no alcohol at all. So Sir David Spiegelhalter did was draw attention to actually what the statistics in that paper really showed. And what they showed was, I think he likened it to this, that if 25,000 people bought 400,000 bottles of gin and they drank them at the same rate, then one of those people would develop a problem. One of those people would develop a problem. And 149,999 would not, or 24,999 would not. He said there's no safe level of eating bacon. There's no safe level of driving. There's no safe
Driving.
level
Yeah.
of anything. There's no safe level of living, but most people give it a go. And so it's all about telling the truth, telling the facts. But that doesn't stop. I've been subscribing to the New York Times for many years now, and it doesn't stop them repeatedly publishing articles that fundamentally are based on this flawed paper in The Lancet. And recently there was a paper published from one of the health organizations in the US that actually said, the stories about moderate alcohol consumption benefiting and cutting down the risk of coronary heart disease are actually genuine. But the New York Times is all over that, saying, well, it's flawed. But they don't point out the flaws in the other papers, the naysaying papers. It's very difficult because human beings don't simply drink alcohol. They do other things with their lives. And if you're drawing
Well,
correlations,
most of them.
if you're drawing correlations between alcohol consumption and health, the correlations are very difficult to see because there are other things these people are doing. You might drink significant amounts of alcohol, but you may smoke. And you could draw a correlation between cancer and the alcohol, but actually the true correlation is between the alcohol and smoking. It's a secondary correlation that's maybe not genuine. And so there's lots of examples of that. So unless you sort of sit down somebody and just ply them with alcohol for years on end and see what the effect is, you're always going to have a difficult job at drawing correlations, whether you're claiming a negative influence or even if you're claiming a positive influence. So it is genuinely a difficult area to plow, row to hoe, if you whatever the saying would be. And you've got to look at all of these studies critically, whether they are claiming a benefit or whether they're claiming a negative impact. And quite apart from the drink itself, all of the social aspects in and around the consumption of a drink like beer cannot be understated. It's a very important part of fabric of so many societies.
Sure. Well, and to be fair, when we're talking about the role that alcohol has played in human history, I mean, you could actually go back to pre-human history, and it's well known that there are animals that have been seeking altered states. Many members of the primate world eat fermenting fruit off the floor of the forest and things of that nature. So, actually tying it back to what you said about people are going to find a way to do it, not just people, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you try to deprive somebody of something that they enjoy and value as part of their life, then you try to stop them doing it, they'll find a way of getting around it. In prohibition, I believe I'm correct in saying that when the Volstead Act kicked in and prohibition came around, there was something like a 500% increase in drunk driving offenses in Chicago. I mean,
Mhm.
and they were getting the alcohol, and some of it was dodgy alcohol and risky, but people wanted it, and you were depriving them of it. And and it's like in Australia, they had a thing called the 6 o'clock swill, which people come out of the offices and the factories at 5 o'clock. They go straight into the bar. All the beer was lined up on the bar. The people would grab hold of 2 glasses, consume them quickly, put them down. More beer was hosed in, and they'd do this for an hour because the pub was going to shut at 6 o'clock. You try to stop somebody doing something in moderation, and they're just going to abuse it. So the reality is, in my opinion, people should just tell the truth, tell the facts about beer. It is not empty calories. There's a lot of nutritional value in beer. But if you avoid it equally, you may be missing a very beneficial part of your diet. So it's moderation that is the real way in which people have got to respect beer, savor it, enjoy it, a good conversation, and it's something to be respected in every way.
Very well said. So let's dive actually a little bit deeper into at a micro level. You just talked about the beer. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty. What specifically are the like compounds that you're referring to that are, I don't want to call them essential, but that have benefits to
Okay,
humans?
okay, let's take them in no particular order, but let's start with silicate. So silicate is an important part of the diet. It is involved in cutting down the risk of osteoporosis. It's important for bone health. And one of the richest sources of silicate in the diet is beer. And the beer comes from the husk. So when you're mashing, you extract silicate from the husk. So obviously there's more silicate in a barley-based beer than there is in a wheat-based beer because the wheat doesn't provide any husk. And the more aggressive you are, the more silicate you extract. So really, pretty much your daily needs for silicate could be satisfied by a couple of beers, and it will cut down the risk of less than healthy bones. The next one is fiber. So your listeners will doubtless have heard of the sort of cell walls in the barley, and brewers worry about these things because they wrap around the protein and starch. So the cell walls in the barley grain, the malt, they consist of complicated carbohydrates called polysaccharides. And the brewer wants to break these down because they're a problem in the process. But the stuff that survives, and in particular there's one that survives, it's called pentosan. It survives into the beer, and it is soluble fiber. It is soluble fiber. So again, a couple of beers will give you a good dose of your daily need for soluble fiber, and probably in a more appealing way of consuming it than a plate full of cereal, maybe.
And so but from an efficacy standpoint, is the fiber content, I mean, is it nominal or
Oh,
is it
oh, it's
actually is
significant,
okay. Oh, it
significant.
is. Okay.
So, as I say, a couple of glasses gives you a good hefty dose of your daily needs for soluble fiber. Now, some of those cell wall components, the so-called beta glucans, they do get broken down more than the pentasans. but they don't get broken down all the way to glucose. They make smaller sugars, things with a few glucoses linked together. And these are not metabolized by the yeast, so they survive into the beer. And what we showed is they get all the way down to the large intestine and they support the growth of beneficial bacteria. We call them prebiotics. So beer contains prebiotics. You go to a health store and they talk about prebiotics and probiotics. Beer contains prebiotics. Beer contains B vitamins, especially folic acid. So there's a significant level of B vitamins in beer. Years ago, there was a diet called the South Beach diet. Well, I think it's still around. And they used to
Yeah, I've
say
heard of
the
that.
worst thing in the world you can have is beer, because beer contains maltose. And maltose is the worst possible carbohydrate for the glycemic index. So I wrote to the author and I said, have you ever heard of fermentation? The maltose is converted into alcohol. So they've changed it. Due to recent research, we can rescind the ban on beer. I mean, give me a break. But the carbohydrates that are present in beer, the dextrins that come from the starch, they're what we call slow release carbohydrates. So actually they release the sugar, the energy gradually. Antioxidants, people talk a lot about antioxidants in wine and tea and so on. Well, there's antioxidants in beer, in particular something called ferulic acid. Now, ferulic acid is an interesting substance. It's the stuff that gets converted into the clovey flavor in Hefeweizen. But the ferulic acid itself is an antioxidant, and it was shown that it gets into the body very efficiently. Most studies on antioxidants, they haven't shown that those antioxidants actually get to the parts that matter. But beer and ferulic acid, it has been shown that the ferulic acid does get to where it needs to do its job. And there are other minerals as well in the beer. There is a significant level of beneficial materials in beer. It's far, far from being empty calories.
And like, what is the point of diminishing returns? At what point are the negative side effects of excessive alcohol consumption outweighing the nutritional benefits from a lot of the things that you just mentioned there?
Well,
Do
I
we
mean,
know that even?
no, not really, but I mean, all beers will contain these sorts of materials, including the alcohol-free beers. But it depends on the process. It depends on the grist materials. So as I've said, silicate is a lot more in barley malt than there is in wheat. So if you've got a wheat beer, you're going to have proportionally less silicate than with a barley-based beer. Or if you use a lot of adjuncts like corn and rice and so on, then proportionally you're going to have less silicate. But you're always going to have, in all of these beers, you're going to have ferulic acid. Again, that will depend. If you mash at a lower temperature, you get more ferulic acid than if you mash at a higher temperature. So it depends on those process conditions as well. So when you're talking about, well, what is an unsafe level of alcohol, I think you need to take it in its, just the alcohol, consider just the alcohol, because you're not trying to really identify what that balance is. And, to my mind, moderate consumption, let's say you've got a beer of 5% ABV, then I would say moderation is 1 to 2 of those per day. And as I usually, with slight tongue in cheek, say, if you're trying to get silicate, you don't have all 14 on Saturday night, because that's binge drinking, So it's moderation in terms of avoiding excessive alcohol consumption at any one sitting. The idea of moderation in Bavaria is probably very different to what it is in Utah, so definitions of moderation will vary. And of course, what I haven't mentioned is probably the most significant component of beer when it comes to health. It is actually alcohol, from a positive perspective as well. The red wine folks, they used to claim that the key ingredient in red wine that cuts down the risk of building up of bad cholesterol in the arteries is something called resveratrol. But that was all done with laboratory rats. And if you fed people red wine to get enough resveratrol to show the effects that they had with the rats, that'd be over 100 bottles of red wine every day. So, I mean, the stupidity on all sides. But it was shown and very clearly claimed that the active component in cutting down the risk of atherosclerosis is actually the alcohol itself. So that is why, and again, let me stress, these claims are being challenged all over the place, but there's been so much work over so many years which has pointed out the moderate consumption of alcohol cuts down the risk of atherosclerosis, coronary heart disease, which I believe is still the biggest killer in the United States of America. Now, there are a lot of people who are saying that's just not true. But just because they shout loudly and say it's not true does not negate all the many studies that have indicated that there is truth in this concept. And that, again, is being challenged right now with two sides of the argument. So who do you trust? And you've got to bring it back to the science every time. You've got to trust the science. And hopefully that science has been well done and statistically properly interpreted.
Now, because we were just talking a little bit about non-alcoholic beer, we don't produce non-alcoholic beer, so I don't want to dive too deep into this, but I know that there's a couple different methods to produce non-alcoholic beer. One, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of them would be to, you basically are just selling unfermented wort. And then the other would be to fully produce a beer and then dealkalize it. Are there other methods that you are aware of that, and how do they differ from a nutritional standpoint? Because you had mentioned the maltose, for example, being converted to alcohol, right? So in theory, a dealkalized beer would have greater health benefits potentially than wort NA beer because because it's gone through that process. Is that accurate?
I mean, the wort will contain, and depends how it's produced. So if you produce the wort with very high temperatures in mashing, you're going to produce less maltose. You're going to have largely sort of the bigger starch molecules. So with the wort, you're going to have a lot more carbohydrate in there. That's the reality. But of course, things like the silicate, depending on the grist and the process, and the other things, they're going to be there. If you make beer through dealkalization, then basically you're just stripping the alcohol and the volatiles, the flavor substances, the esters, the fruity molecules, the alcohols, the sulfur compound. You're stripping those off, but you're leaving everything else behind. So, in terms of its composition from a health perspective, with all the things like the ferulic acid and the fiber and vitamins and so on, they're still going to be there. There is another way of making alcohol-free beer, and that is to use a yeast that does not metabolize maltose. So it actually doesn't produce alcohol. And there are various tricks there. I think the simplest way of viewing it is that irrespective of the way in which you make the alcohol-free beer, the things I've mentioned, the components that I talked about earlier, they are going to be there. I mean, it's not simply saying they're going to be exactly the same levels. It depends on so many factors. But you could still make those claims about nutritional value for alcohol-free beers. Psychologically, Cameron, I can't go into a store and buy alcohol-free beer. When I was with Bass, I actually reformulated the composition of one of the alcohol-free beers, which was called Barbican. And we did that by dealkalizing our mainstream lager beer by vacuum stripping. And but I really could never really enjoy it. What I used to do, but then again, I don't choose to drink decaffeinated coffee. But there's a similarity here that will grind up a mixture, 50-50 mixture of genuine coffee beans and decaffeinated beans and get a 50-50. And in the same way, when I was at the Bass Company, and I used to play a lot of cricket for Bass, go to the pub and I would have a pint glass with a half pint of the regular beer in there and a half pint of the alcohol-free beer mixed together. So I got a low alcohol product of around 2.5%. And that little bit of alcohol made a big difference, a big difference, in my opinion. So psychologically, I'm not attuned to consuming alcohol-free beer. If I don't want alcohol, I'll drink something else. That's not to rubbish the concept. A lot of people enjoy them, they like them, and that's great. That's fine. In Germany, they're almost marketed as a sportsman's drink. But not for me. But not all beers are for me anyway. There are many regular alcohol-containing beers that I don't like. I personally don't get the concept of a dry January. If people are worried about calories, then you got to remember the main source of calories in any alcoholic beverage is the alcohol. And yeah, if you cut it out, then you're cutting down the calorie count. But what are the other calories you're cutting as well? And you might as well say, well, I'll keep the benefits from having the beer and I'll cut out the calories from X, Y, or Z that's on your menu. Cut out the cheesecake, cut out the cookies, have a cookie-free January. So I think beer gets a bad rap. Alcohol generally gets a bad rap with this dry January, and I personally just don't get it. Count the calories throughout the year, and don't forget to include the calories that are coming from your favorite alcoholic beverage.
Yeah, very, very well said. I agree about the non-alcoholic beer thing. I don't personally enjoy it. I'd rather just drink water or, in this case, pop spritz, product
Good
placement.
segue. Good
Alert.
segue.
Yeah. But I also don't think any reasonable person, if you could have an alcoholic beer that somehow tasted exactly the same without the alcohol in it, and you put it next to an NA beer the way that we understand NA beer to taste now, I don't think any sane person would choose the latter over the former. There are certain sacrifices that are made, right? Or maybe we've deluded ourselves into thinking that it tastes just as good. I don't know what the psychology is behind it other than we accept it for what it is in the interest of
Yeah.
cutting out the alcohol, whatever the motive is.
I think the way you've got to view it is, look, do I actually enjoy that drink? Um, and is it possible to make a pleasant drink that is based on malt, hops, and water and so on, and market it as a pleasant drink in its own right, and it just happens not to contain alcohol, and it has great flavor, then so be it. But if you're playing that card of saying, look, these are the alcohol containing beers, here are alcohol-free ones, and I urge you to drink the alcohol-free beers because they're healthier for you than the alcohol-containing ones. That's just not true. That's a lie. And I think it's how they're positioned and how they're marketing. There's lots of brewers that are making alternative alcohol-containing beverages, alcoholic teas and alcoholic fruit juices and so on. And they're saying, well, they're healthier because they don't have all that carbohydrate in them and so on. Well, it's the alcohol,
Yeah.
and I'm from England, and I'm used to draft cask ales that are somewhere between 3 and 4% ABV. And the reason is that, and I don't want to promote a taxation argument here, but the reason they're lower in alcohol is because in the UK, you pay tax, the brewer pays tax in proportion to the alcohol content. So the more alcohol, the more expensive. So this tends to keep the alcohol contents down. And, so a pint of 3.5% English cask condition ale, which is, I always say it's like, an angel weeping on your tongue, goes down very nicely. And has got lower calories in it than a 5% alcoholic tea.
Right.
So if they're playing the calorie card, and the 5% alcoholic tea is not going to have the same nutritional value as the cask ale. So people need to tell the truth. They need the facts. They need the facts. And again, it comes back to the difficulty. But if Charlie Bamforth, professor of brewing science, says this about beer, you can't trust him because he's in the brewing industry. Please trust me, but there's a credibility factor there. But if it's, somebody totally independent, ideally a medic, and says, these are the facts. So I don't know. There's a lot of money being spent on encouraging people to be naysayers. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. It seems like beer has become the new sugar. At
Yeah,
one point it was fat, right?
yeah,
And then it
yeah,
became sugar, and
yeah,
now it's alcohol. And so
yeah.
hopefully this is cyclical, and
I
like
hope so.
many things are.
And what it really boils down to is you've got to have in the media and places where people are getting their messages, they've got to be founded on fact, not prejudice, but founded on fact. But
Sure.
if we're not careful, we'll end up in all sorts of different directions on that one.
Yeah, so let me actually expand on that. That actually transitions really nicely into my next question, which is the notion that beer belly, well, the term beer belly has
Yeah.
been thrown around for a lot of years. And does that buzzword or narrative actually come from anything rooted in facts? Is there anything uniquely fattening from a metabolic perspective about the calories? Okay. Okay.
No, there was a paper by a couple of authors, I think, from memory, Wanamathi and Shaper, and they said it's basically a myth, and it's calories. It's calories. And the reality is that beer drinkers often have a different lifestyle to something like, say, a wine drinker. I usually teasingly say, wine drinkers jog, beer drinkers don't jog. They watch ball games, and eat burgers. So it's not the beer per se, but it's the lifestyle. Somebody would say, Charlie, you got a beer belly. I said, no, it's not. It's a sausage belly, for goodness sake. And there was a study in Copenhagen a long time ago now. And what they did was stand outside supermarkets and ask people to give them a copy, the printout of what they've been buying. And they made a stack of those who've been buying wine and a stack of receipts of those who've been buying beer. And the people buying wine have been buying, bottled water and vegetables and low-fat spreads and so on. People buying beer were buying butter and bread and red meat and burgers and cigarettes.
Interesting.
Again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier on. Human beings do not just live on their chosen alcoholic beverage. They do lots of other things. And the lifestyle is so very, very important. I would argue consume beer in moderation as part of a well-balanced, healthy, vigorous, active lifestyle. But don't sort of overindulge in a sedentary way in which you're stuffing your face with endless burgers and so on. It's getting that, it's part of the balance. You can't just point everything negative at beer. It's ridiculous.
So it's fair to say that compared to wine and spirits, beer is more harshly judged because of its perception rather than the actual chemistry of it. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about its energy balance seems to be an absolute rule
Yeah.
when it
I mean,
comes to.
totally. Yeah. Beer contains all of the nutrients I mentioned earlier on. Wine doesn't. They claim about the antioxidants, but they've not got the same nutritional value in a wine. And of course, a distilled beverage, I mean, when you're you're bringing off the alcohol and some flavors and so on, but you're leaving all the other stuff, let's say a whiskey, which I enjoy, I love it. But all of the stuff that's left behind that comes from the malt, say in a Scotch whiskey, that's not in the vapors that come off on the still. So yeah, there's the alcohol. Again, the same argument for moderation applies. When you see a story on say on the news talking about alcohol, they don't show pictures of vodka, glasses of vodka, because how do you know it's vodka? It could just easily be water. And they don't show wine. It could easily be blackcurrant juice or something. They show beer because everybody knows what a beer looks like. It's got the bubbles on top, hasn't it? That's a beer. And so it's beer that gets the image. When people are talking about alcohol negatively, they're always showing beer. And I would argue very, very strongly that of all the beverages, on an equivalent alcohol basis, beer is easily the healthiest of those beverages. But it's the one that gets the bad rap.
I think a lot of it too is that when you have especially nowadays, you've got this proliferation of a lot of different like beer alternatives in the alcohol space, alcohol and non-alcoholic space. But beer is kind of it's the old guy that the young guys like to point to and go, well, that's my parents' drink, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like it's not cool to drink beer. It was very cool 2 decades ago, a decade ago.
Right.
And now all of a sudden it's, what have you done for me lately?
Absolutely. If the more people put these alternatives and claiming things like, well, they're less fattening and so on, I think that is dishonest. And I also think it's too risky from a perspective of moderation. I don't think some of these other beverages are drinks of moderation. By the way, one thing we haven't said much about are, of course, the hops. And, there are some fairly strong proponents that say, hops, closest relative, marijuana, a lot of interest in the health potential from marijuana. What about the hops? They contain a lot of interesting pharmacologically active substances. And I think there's a lot more mileage in that as well. So again, the whole concept of hops being a healthy component of beer. Now, I'm not a big fan of the bringing the marijuana and the beer together, and we stress that. But the point I'm making is the hops are closely related botanically, and there are a lot of interesting substances in those hops. I rather suspect that in the future, those substances will be delivered not in the form of beer, but hop-derived products that are available in the pharmacy. But if there is a way of mining that, then I think that's a very interesting territory.
Yeah. So bringing it full circle here, what do you think the future of beer and nutrition looks like? Who's going to pick up the torch and come to beer's defense?
It can't be me because A, I'm getting old, and B, as I say, been in the industry since 1978. It can't be a brewer. There are legal reasons why it can't be a brewer. It's got to be it's got to be the culinary world pointing out that beer is a better match for foods than wine in most cases. It's got to
Well,
be fair-minded medical people who are able to interpret the science and say, look, these are the facts. It's got to be some totally independent, can't be paid for by brewers. It's got to be some totally independent team. And I
mm,
don't have a clear idea of what that would be, who can say, look, I don't know whether a panel of journalists, a panel of culinary experts, medics, and so on, who come together and say, let's look at the facts, let's discuss the reality and present an independent opinion on the truth when it comes to beer as part of a moderate, healthy lifestyle.
yeah, I think the challenge is going to be there are many, many topics that are tackled by the likes of the Academy of Sciences that never make it to mass media, right? And so who's going to perpetuate and publish this data? Even if you can even if you can get folks to sign up to do this, whether they're hired an independent agency or whether they just take interest in it on their own or they're compelled to do it. For example, the first person or the first agency that came to mind is actually the Brewers Association, right? Like you would think that this is straight up their alley. It benefits their members. Of course, there is, like you said, a lot of folks would point to them as having bias because they represent the Brewers. Uh, But they could be involved via a couple degrees of separation, certainly,
Uh,
or at least hire an agency maybe using member
yeah.
dues.
Yeah, again, it comes down to the fact of money. So if the money is coming from a, a brewing related organization, then that's going to be the first thing that is flagged up in the articles I was talking about in that celebrated US newspaper. The first thing they point out is, well, that scientist was paid for by a brewing by the brewing industry, and therefore loses all credibility. So it's got to be something completely independent from brewing. You know, in Europe, the brewers of Europe, they have come together and they publish, there's a web page that they have all about the health impacts of alcohol, both positive and negative. But again, it's the naysayers will always say, well, you're going to say that. It's what does it say? Brewers of Europe, brewers of Europe. So it has got to be something that is completely independent, but it's got to be populated by people like Spiegelhalter from Cambridge, who there's no axe to grind, as far as I can tell. He just wants to actually point out the realities of what scientific literature is saying without fear or favor. So people like that.
Well, the USDA and the Cattle Ranchers Association have been getting away with it for years. Now,
It's not
someone
gonna.
points to them and they just stomp them out,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah. What is milk? Is milk? Can you have something that's soy milk? Can you have that? Oat milk? I mean, it's not milk. Yeah, there's a lot of lobbying. The lobbying is a
Yeah.
very important concept in this country, and I really don't want to get too political. But you know, it's easy to give alcohol a bad rap. You know, it's got to be treated with respect. But when people say there's no safe level of drinking alcohol, that is patently as ridiculous as saying there's no safe level of drinking water or there's no
Mm.
safe level of breathing. Because if you go breathing in different atmospheres, you're going to have different effects. I just want the facts to be spelled out and for people to make their fair-minded judgment. And I personally am firmly convinced that the healthiest beverage is beer.
I had a wrap up question, but I don't think that I could punctuate the conversation any better than you just did right there. So I'm going to leave it right there.
All right.
Um, Charlie, it's been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for bringing clarity, balance, science to a topic that often gets lost in extremes. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast, The Craft Equation, wherever you listen. And Dr. Bamforth, I really hope that this is not the last convo we're able to have about brewing science. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
My absolute pleasure.
Like what you see? There's more where that came from. Check out our other content or find us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to drop a comment and let us know what topics you'd like to see covered on The Craft Equation.